Okay, in this video we're going to think briefly about the evidence for the resurrection, and then we're going to think about the explanation of that evidence. Now, the evidence is the easy bit. There are 4 pieces of evidence that are not controversial. There's nothing miraculous about them. They're just basic evidence, okay? And it's evidence that we need to interpret. We need to explain the evidence. So the evidence is not controversial. The evidence is this. Number 1, that Jesus Christ lived. Number 2, that he was crucified under Pontius Pilate. Number 3, that he was placed in a tomb, but the tomb was later found empty. And number 4, that the disciples preached and proclaimed that Jesus was risen from the grave. Now, those 4 bits of evidence, there's nothing extraordinary about them. People sometimes say, extraordinary claims demand extraordinary evidence. Well, the evidence that we're presenting is not in and of itself extraordinary. The explanation of the evidence in itself does not necessarily need to be extraordinary. There's nothing extraordinary about claiming that a man called Jesus lived who claimed to be the Messiah. Actually, a lot of people were called Jesus in Jesus' time, and a number of them claimed to be the Messiah. Not all of them, but when Jesus was being crucified, he was being crucified and executed alongside another man called Barabbas. But Barabbas' first name was also Jesus, so Jesus was a common name. So that first bit of evidence, there's nothing controversial about that. Scholars agree, Jesus actually lived. That he was crucified under Pontius Pilate. We'll look at it a bit later, but there's evidence outside of the Bible that makes it clear that Jesus was actually crucified under Pontius Pilate. The third bit of evidence, that he was placed in a tomb and that the tomb was found empty. Again, that is not controversial. It's not a particularly extraordinary thing that a tomb was found empty. Tombs are often empty. When they don't have a body in them, they're empty. And sometimes people would steal bodies and from tombs. So that the tomb was empty is not extraordinary in and of itself. And that the disciples proclaimed that Jesus is risen, that is not particularly extraordinary. I would proclaim today that Jesus is risen. So none of those bits of evidence are extraordinary. They're just basic pieces of evidence that are not controversial. However, those bits of evidence need explanation. You see, I would argue that those 4 bits of evidence point conclusively, pretty much, to a resurrection. Now, obviously, most people in the world who look at this stuff disagree. In fact, they don't look at it, people just disagree. They say resurrections don't happen. But I want to encourage us to just allow the evidence to point where it points to, and ask ourselves, what does it suggest? Now, as we try and explain the evidence, any explanation of the evidence needs 2 things. It needs explanatory power and it needs explanatory scope. I'll just explain what those things mean. Number 1, explanatory power. What that means is the explanation that we give in interpreting the evidence has got to have enough power to explain why, for example, the disciples were preaching that Jesus is alive. It's got to be something that would cause them to say that. Why would they say that? Why would they say they've seen Jesus and risk, in fact, all of them but one were martyred for it? Why would they do that? The explanation has got to account for that. It's got to have explanatory power. But any explanation has got to also have explanatory scope. In other words, it's got to explain all 4 of those pieces of evidence. It's easy to deny the resurrection by explaining away 1 bit of evidence, but it's got to explain all 4 pieces of evidence. So we're going to look at the various interpretations of the evidence that exist, and we're going to assess and examine to see do they have explanatory scope and explanatory power. So we'll begin looking at that in the next videos.